Okay, welcome everyone to this public launch event for the Scottish International Development Alliance's new report on improving policy coherence in Scotland. My name is Geraldine Hill. I am the Deputy Chair of the Board of the Alliance and I will be chairing the meeting today. The format for this morning is that we will start with a presentation from Lewis Ryder-Jones, who is Deputy Chief Exec at the Alliance. Lewis is going to introduce a report for us and the online body of work that underpins it, our wiki document. We'll then move on to a panel discussion with special guests and an open Q&A session after that, and we will close by 12:30. Before going any further, I'm going to cover a few housekeeping things. So we're recording the meeting and that will be used to help us develop a PCSD online course in the coming months. This is a webinar, so you're all muted at this stage and one of the team will unmute you when you have a question. Please use the chat box to let us know that you can hear okay and to introduce yourselves to fellow participants with your name and organisation. An Alliance staff member is monitoring this to answer any technical queries that you might have. And as questions occur to you, please do write them up into the Q&A box, which is in the black toolbar at the bottom of your screens. And write them in as you come up with them and not in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring them. That would be helpful. Great, so we're going to move on to Lewis's presentation. So Lewis, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Geraldine. Welcome everyone today. What a great turnout. I can see already people are still coming into the call, but we'll get going. My name is Lewis Ryder-Jones, as Geraldine said. I'm the Deputy CEO at Scotland's International Development Alliance. For those of you who don't know us, we're the membership body in Scotland for organisations and individuals from any sector who work towards sustainable development internationally out of Scotland. And I actually think it's particularly fitting today that the attendee list represents such a diverse range of interest groups across an array of policy areas and interest groups within the Scottish context. I was looking at the participant list yesterday and I saw everything from parliamentary staff and MSPs to academics from I think 6 or 7 different institutions, civil servants at both Scottish and UK level. And I was also really happy to see some local government representation and of course colleagues from across the environmental, development, human rights and private sectors. Apologies if I've missed anyone there. Really that's the point of today, to bring together a broad range of actors across civic space to discuss how we can all work together a bit better, I suppose. And that's really where I want to focus on later in this short presentation. But I want to start by also admitting that I don't see myself as an expert in any one particular policy area. I think that's partly why I feel I can get excited about policy coherence, because it is such a cross-cutting, process-driven idea, and I guess that feeling of interest in lots of areas and being kind of bound by a passion for sustainable development is really what gets me excited by policy coherence. But maybe I'm alone in that. Let's see where the discussion takes us later. But the fact I don't see myself as an expert is why we asked actual experts to join the panel today. So I'm going to be as quick as I can going through this so we can get to the main part of the event. So I'm going to share just a couple of slides with you before we get going. So let me bring these up and hopefully this will work for us. So there we go. I think that will be, hopefully you can all see the slides here. I will just move us on to the first slide. Yeah, so really I just want to say 2 main things. The first thing is obviously introducing you to this new report that we launched at the start of May, and tell you why policy coherence and improving policy coherence in Scotland is so vital at this point in time, probably more than ever before, and why we think it's genuinely feasible. And the second thing is I really want to ask all of you, and it's a big call out, to get involved with this work and help us develop what we're doing further using the online body of work that's underpinned much of what's in the report. But I'll get back to that second part in a minute. Moving on to my first main slide. So, well, our shop window report, as I like to call it, is a shop window report. It's designed to be as short as possible, and it really aims to just introduce policy coherence as a concept. And for us, at its core, that simply means systemic and systematic approaches to working together. It's about making sure that our actions and the actions taken by one part of government or sector within society don't undermine positive actions taken by others, preferably supporting and reinforcing one another. I think in these uncertain times with COVID-19 that brings us together online like this, this is more apparent than ever before that we need to make sure this happens. And the obvious example is thinking about how we restart our economy. We're all talking about it, we're all thinking about it. A coherent policy approach to that is obviously not just considering the short-term public health and social implications of ending lockdown, but thinking beyond that and thinking about the economic and crucially environmental long-term concerns and impacts of what decisions we make now. And I guess in this sense, for me, policy coherence is really relevant to all sectors of society, all parts of government, and it's essential for achieving the big frameworks of the day, such as the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and crucially for creating the fairer, kinder, more prosperous Scotland that most of us want to see. A caveat to all of this is, though, that I come from the international development sector, and the organisations and individuals that I represent have a very specific aspect of this that we see as crucially important, and that is making sure that we put equality and solidarity with the most marginalised and vulnerable people across the globe at the heart of everything we do, not just our external relations. Now, of course, we can't do that unless we see policy coherence as being about the bigger whole as well. So that's why we're more and more committed, and that's why this report is aiming to be more committed to seeing policy coherence as more than just the international dimension, and seeing sustainable development as cross-border, domestic and international. It doesn't know any borders, sustainable development, I guess in the same way that COVID-19 doesn't. So the report outlines and defines, we hope in accessible terms, what PCSD is, as I've already mentioned, makes some ambitious but important recommendations for both government and Parliament, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the discussion later. So I won't get bogged down in them, because crucially, it's also aiming to drive people towards this online body of work that I have already mentioned at the start. With this broader aim of increasing support and understanding from as wide a range of sectors as possible for enhancing coherence for sustainable development in Scotland and elsewhere. So that really brings me on to the collaboration aspect. We think it's essential for us to be part of a broader movement of interested parties that care about sustainable development, and that has to go beyond our own sector because it's vital for achieving, that better world wherever we are. But enhancing PCSD is really about changing the way in which we develop policy, the way we scrutinize policy, the way we evaluate our policy decisions, as well as just being involved in shaping it. So this really requires changes to the policy making and legislative processes. But I suppose, as many of us are really acutely aware of who have worked in any policy environment, whether outside or inside government, these changes always require broad buy-in and support from many different interest groups. And I guess this is particularly important for PCSD because it is in all honesty, rarely explicitly supported by an interest group who has a sustainable development outcome as its aim. It's an implicit part of achieving that goal, but rarely is it explicitly talked about as a necessary process. And that's really the point here, that any genuine chance of making progress on PCSD requires stakeholders, engagement by government to be involved in those processes, and broad participation by the rest of us at levels that we've rarely seen before. It is an inherently political process, PCSD. It asks us to acknowledge and sometimes even justify really significant trade-offs that we make as society, and therefore those of us with sustainable development aspirations, we need to be as united as we possibly can be in order to remove some of those political tensions that are always going to be there. A PCSD approach, I think, helps to do this. It helps to unite groups with differing goals. And even with the great uniting and unifying frameworks under human rights or the SDGs, which we are great advocates for, and in Scotland at local level, the National Performance Framework, we still see many parts of government and civil society groups, which is really important, operating in silos. And I really hate that expression because it's almost overused and often not explained as to what we mean. But what that silo operation does is it presents a disunited front to the Scottish public, which I believe we need to change because it helps us all achieve a less political environment to try and really work through PCSD issues. A big part of PCSD from my perspective, therefore, is looking at our own focus through a sustainable development lens. It's being open to critique, and it's seeing ourselves as connected to others, no matter what the sector. And that's really where our online body of work comes in, the wiki. Moving on to, I think, my last slide here. A wiki, from one dictionary definition I looked at the other day, is defined as a website that's developed collaboratively by a community of users, allowing any user to add and edit content. The most successful wiki is, of course, Wikipedia. I mean, I can't imagine there's anyone here who hasn't at some point gleaned info on some random topic that's not related to the task at hand that they're doing from Wikipedia. I was looking the other day when I was preparing these slides at the size of the International Space Station. It turns out it's bigger than a football pitch. Anyway, I'm digressing. The point is that the key in a wiki's design is that over time, through peer review and collaboration, the information within it is honed, detail is added, and accuracy is improved. Now, with Wikipedia, that is difficult because of the sheer scale and size of an all-encompassing encyclopedia of information, and it takes much more time. With our shared and open space for developing understanding on policy coherence issues in Scotland being much more focused, we can suggest solutions, track progress, stimulate debate, and therefore that application of peer review and collaboration becomes much faster if we can get different users to develop it. That improvement and honing will take place on a much more rapid timescale. The wiki itself right now contains information around the background on policy coherence from a development perspective, frameworks for action that I've already touched upon, and something that I'm hoping Ernesto during the panel discussion will explore some more around the work the OECD have done. Something I'm a big fan of. Key thematic policy areas in Scotland where policy coherence can be improved and is already being improved. Even the beginnings of a tool that measures progress, although this needs a lot of work, and introductions to a variety of mechanisms that can improve coherence, again, some of which will be talked about later, such as the Scottish Parliament's Sustainable Development Impact Assessment tool that Ishani will talk about in the panel discussion. But actually, for me, this wiki, given its use as a collaborative space for creating ideas, is actually a tool in its own right as well for improving policy coherence. if we can galvanize interest in using it, or indeed not even this wiki, other wikis or other software like it, as a means to co-create ideas through peer review and collaboration, I think we're onto something. You know, the open government partnership approach that the Scottish Government signed up to a few years ago have actually led on this, and we're not the first people to look at this way of doing things. It was something that we've definitely taken our lead from. And we think that developing wikis like this can really improve participation and collaboration within and outside government, potentially, especially if we can persuade enough government officials to get on board with it. But at the heart of all of this, we believe an open and transparent approach to idea creation is really vital to encourage the multi-stakeholder, multi-sector buy-in for holistic action on any particular issue. But there is a problem with this site because it was created by ourselves and our members who are in the most part international development organizations. It has a particular focus on that international domestic dimension. Now, I see that as a good thing because obviously I want that dimension to be critical to our decisions going forward, representing the sector that I do. But that is only one aspect of the policy coherence for sustainable development conundrum. It's one side of the Rubik's Cube, as it were. And to fully live up to PCSD as a concept, the resource needs input from other sectors and stakeholders to be genuinely useful for decision makers to improve PCSD across the whole of government. So to date, we've done okay. We've had further contributions from environmental perspectives, thanks Rushir, from gender, thanks to the advisory group on women and girls, and also from a climate perspective. But I think we can do better, and I really want to see this wiki develop further. So that's really how I want to end today, as a call to all of you before we move into the discussion around policy coherence, is to read through what's there, think about how PCSD relates to your work, and what do you think might be missing? Where can improvements be made? And just before I finish, I'm going to get rid of that particular screen so you can see me again. And I am going to actually try and answer that particular last question myself and actually show you. Now, I hope that you can now see my browser. And I'm going to try and answer my own question around where things might be missing and what improvements can be made by showing you a couple of things, and particularly, crucially, showing you how easy it is to edit pages so you don't see participation on a software like this as any kind of barrier. So I'm currently on the home page. I believe you should be able to see it. Can I get a thumbs up from Cara? Thank you very much, great. So this is the main home page. You will see there are different sections of the wiki where it says what you'll find across this site. You can navigate to these by clicking on the hyperlink, or on the left-hand side, the navigation bar, you can also navigate. So let me give you a little example here. If we go to background on policy coherence, you'll see the contents is at the top of the page. There are different sections. It's incredibly easy to add a section if you think something's missing. You can go in and edit an existing section. So I created one the other day. It's a bit like Blue Peter, this. Called How is Policy Coherence Approached or Not in Different Sectors? Now, if I wanted to edit that section, it says to be completed. I just scroll over edit, whether I'm logged in or not, it doesn't matter. I click on that, it loads up. I then go back to that section. I can delete to be completed, and I can add in a question like, I don't know, are the concepts the same but the language different? Which I think I know the answer to, and I think often that is the problem. Policy coherence language is quite specific to the development sector, but the actual concepts are shared among many of our sectors, and it's something we need to break down barriers through. So maybe this is a chance to this. Then I would just, I've done my edit, I would go up to the top right, I would save change, and then a little window will pop up and say, what do I want to do? Now, if I'm logged in as a user, which I would suggest that you create a login, you don't have to, you can then watch this page. What that means is anybody else comes along and edits this particular section, I will get a notification telling me they've done so. And that's where the peer review element to this comes in. I can also say what my edit is by typing in the box, and I can say if it's a minor edit or not. So I will just say minor and then save changes. And lo and behold, the edit is now being made. Are the concepts the same but the language different? So that's just a little example. Other sections that I think need to be developed are all across this wiki. So please go in there and have a look. The key thematic focus areas is just one that I want to highlight because I have created a section on COVID-19 that currently has absolutely nothing in it. And my proposition to the rest of you is, who have much more to say on this issue, is what do we need to do to improve coherence around improving our response, our long-term response to what this crisis has done for Scotland and other places, and equally any other area you feel that could be added in from a policy coherence perspective. I think that's it from me. And I really hope you feel from that short introduction that you can go in there and edit easily. We've created a short guide on how to do so that are in the end of the slides that I presented at the start, with a link to both the wiki and the report. So please share and get involved and have a look. And I think that's it from me for the moment. I'll be here and listening and getting involved in the panel discussion as we move into the next phase of today. So thank you very much, and Geraldine, back to you.
Thank you, Lewis. Great. Thank you for that very practical illustration. That's helpful for people like me. Okay, so I'm going to just cover a few housekeeping things specifically for this when we move into the Q&A section. So we'll be taking questions, as I said, via the Q&A box instead of via the chat box. When you write the questions, please ensure that you say which panelist you want the answer from. And it would also be helpful if you was let us know who you are and what organisation you're from as part of you as you're writing in your question. I'm going to begin by asking our panellists a few questions and give them a little bit of time to go into some detail. But please, as you think about questions, don't hold back, just put them into the Q&A box as they occur to you, as they come up. If you do want to ask your question verbally, please use the raise your hand function, which is on the black panel at the bottom of your screen, and a member of the team will unmute you when it gets to your turn. We can't guarantee that all your questions will be answered, of course, but we will endeavour to try our best. We also hope this is the start of more conversations like this, so if there's an appetite to connect with each other, please share your contact details in the chat box. And also the Alliance community thread can be used for Alliance members. Great, so I'm going to move on now and ask each of our panellists to just briefly give an introduction to who they are. Ishani, could we start with you, please?
Hi, so I'm Ishani Erasmus. I have been working with and for the Parliament in various different guises, I guess, since about 2012 on mainstreaming sustainable development, and most recently as a part-time employee and a part-time PhD student. And I just had a couple of slides to share, if that's okay, Geraldine?
Yeah, well, Shani, could we maybe just wait for the slides, and I'll just ask the others to introduce yourselves, and then we can come back, yeah? Fab, sure. Thank you. Graham Long, Dr. Graham Long, could you please say a few words of introduction?
Yeah, hi. I'm a senior lecturer at Newcastle University, so not far from Scotland. These days I work on the SDGs, on implementation and review at kind of global, national, subnational, local scales. So I did some work on Scotland last year for the Scottish Government. Current projects are working with WWF and also with the Greater London Authority on SDGs and their kind of relevance in those different settings.
Great, thank you, Graham. Estelle, can we come to you, please? Dr. Estelle Jones.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Estelle Jones, and I work as Deputy Team Lead for the International Development Team at the Scottish Government. We're a relatively small but powerful team, and we are focused on international development in our partner countries, which is Rwanda, Zambia and Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa and Pakistan. And also we are advocates of the Beyond Aid agenda, of which PCSD is an important part. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Estelle. And Ernesto, could you say a few words of introduction, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ernesto Soria. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at the OECD Public Governance Directorate. For the past 10 years, I've been working in supporting OECD governments in strengthening their capacities and institutional mechanisms for policy coherence. So I've been looking at experiences on policy coherence for development, but also policy coherence from the perspective of governance and from the perspective of sustainable development. I've been working on the OECD new standards for policy coherence, and we have developed a recommendation from the OECD, which is designed specifically to support member countries in implementing the sustainable development goals from a coherent perspective. I will be really happy to share with you some of these perspectives, and thank you very much for the invitation.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ernesto. Fantastic. Okay, to kick us off, I'm just going to ask a very general question. Maybe I'll ask this to Ishani. Ishani, what does PCSD mean to you, and why is it important in your work? And please feel free to share your slides.
Okay, so yes, so obviously my work is about sustainable development. So policy coherence is extremely important. So my work in the Parliament, as you all probably know, that the Parliament is part of the governance mechanism for Scotland, and we have lots of different committees who look at lots of different subject areas, and the policy coherence aspect that we're trying to bring to those committees now is very important, because the committees sometimes look at things a bit separate from each other. So they have remits with clear boundaries, but sometimes issues fall between the boundaries. Committees aren't always aware of everything that other committees are doing. So because each committee at the moment mirrors their ministers' portfolios, so the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee will mirror, their remit is exactly the same as Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary's portfolio. So unless we can bring that policy coherence aspect to their work, the policy making process, of which the Parliament is a part, becomes just as fragmented as the government one. So that's what we're working on. Yeah, the slides I wanted to show just very quickly were more relating to sustainable development and the work that I'm doing. So I'm not sure if you can see that. I think you can.
Yes, we can. Yep.
So basically, oh, okay, I can't show you the whole slide. I'm not sure why. One of the problems I find when talking to people who are working on sustainable development goals is that people don't always know what sustainable development is. So I thought I would just show you this slide, if that's okay. I'm trying to show you the actual slide view, but I'm not really sure why I can't do that right now. Okay, I'll just talk to this bit. Oh, here we go, slideshow. Okay, so this is the UK Shared Framework for Sustainable Development. It's the extant policy definition for sustainable development. Sustainable development came out of, the concept arose from two critiques of our economic system that started to emerge after World War II, when the economic system really geared up and there was a massive growth in the parts of the world that are wealthy today. So the two critiques were that our economic system was damaging our ecology, the environment, if you like. So all the systems that provide us with everything we need to actually survive: clean air to breathe, water to drink, soils in which we can grow food, all of that. And the second critique was that it was undermining some of the fairness in society. So it was widening disparities, and there were winners and losers. And you know, people weren't happy with that. So when they put those two things together, they got sustainable development. So that's why you see in the top line here of this diagram, these two essential conditions for sustainable development, which are living within environmental limits and ensuring a strong, healthy, and just society. So it's not about saving the planet. It's about having a society that can go forward in the long term, and can go forward well and fairly. And the environment part is important because we don't want to damage the things that sustain us. So the work I've been doing in the Parliament, I basically refer to it as sustainable development thinking, because when I started trying to explain to people what I'm doing, it really was about getting people to think differently. So when we're from the time we're in school, we're taught to think in, as Lewis said, in silos. So our thinking is, you know, we separate maths from English completely, but maths and English are both languages. We separate geography and history, but geography is historical. So, you know, we don't really connect stuff that well. So I was trying to think about what sustainable development thinking is, and it is all about policy coherence. It's about being critical, as Lewis said, about questioning everything, especially our own assumptions, because if we continue to operate in the world on the basis of assumptions that we have that we don't even realize, we just remake the world in the same mold. I'm not sure, I hope that makes sense. It's about being radical, so not, you know, not being a terrorist, but being continually asking why till we get to the root of the problem. So we don't want to create sticking plaster solutions, you know, tinkering around the edges. We want to actually find the cause of a problem and address that. And sorry, this one's yellow. That was a bad idea. It's about systemic understanding as well, which is very much about policy coherence. So it's about understanding how things interact, you know, what a system is doing, and where the levers in that system are for us to create change. And it's about being holistic, so seeing that everything is part of that one whole. So we can't tackle one thing without having impacts in another area. And this is very much applicable to committees, to maybe government departments, maybe different NGOs, and so on. So really, in sustainable development, we're not looking for trade-offs. We're looking for integrated solutions. We're looking not to, you know, balance things or say, oh, well, if we do this economic thing, we can lose a little bit of environmental gain, or if we address this social thing, okay, we can sacrifice a bit of the economy. We're looking for integrated solutions, so win-win-wins. And really, if you apply a sustainable development lens, obviously you can't guarantee that there's going to be a win-win-win, but more often than not, you can find a way that benefits everybody. So I hope that makes sense. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you.
Yes, that's really why my work, I feel, is important, and why a policy coherence approach is important, and although I've described it in a bunch of different terms.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Ishani. Ernesto, I might come to you and ask you the same question. What does PCSD mean to you, and why is it important in your work?
That's a very important question. Thank you very much. I would also, to explain this, I will also like to share some slides, if I may.
Yes, please do.
This is because the concept of policy coherence is very hard to grasp for policymakers. So in my work, we see policy coherence as both, as a key principle of governance, a principle of international development, and a principle of sustainable development, but also is a means to an end. I mean, it's not an end in itself, it's a means to achieve broader policy goals. So in the area of governance, coherence is necessary to improve effectiveness and reduce fragmentation, overlap, and duplication in operation across the government. if you take, for example, the US, I mean, there was a report that was published last year by the US Government Accountability Office, and they identifies a series of actions and measures from the Congress and executive branch agencies in the past 5 years that helped to improve certain coherence and reduce fragmentation. And these actions have generated about $260 billion US in financial benefits. So it's essentially a principle of sound governance. But in the area of international development, policy coherence is about taking action to avoid negative impacts while at the same time supporting development objectives. And policy coherence in this context aims to avoid a situation in which, for example, one country through development cooperation supports another country's agricultural development, as I'm showing this example, while simultaneously undermining its export opportunities, restricting market access or through tariffs, or forcing developing country farmers to compete with subsidized agricultural production in the donor country. So a coherent policy in this context would be one which opens markets to developing country exports, but also helping the developing country boost its export supply capacity, for example, through aid for trade programs. But experience has shown that in the context of sustainable development, and particularly in the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs, policy coherence takes on a whole new dimension, a more complex dimension. So in this context, policy coherence is a means to ensure that policies support the well-being of people here and now, elsewhere, and the well-being of future generations. So we are talking about here on different dimensions. So supporting the needs of the present and the future generations as called for by the 2030 Agenda and the concept of sustainable development depends on how a society uses and manages its resources, its natural, economic, human, social capital, and other resources. So the more efficiently and sustainable these resources are used, and the better they are managed in the here and now, the more capital is left for people elsewhere on the planet and later for future generations. The problem is that sectoral policies or domestic policies often have a short-term focus and sectoral objectives, and they compete often for the same types of resources. I can explain that perhaps in the Q&A, but to sum up, for us, the PCSD is a means to integrate the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development throughout domestic and international policy making. So in the context of the Agenda 2030, which, as you may know, there is a target under the means of implementation that calls on all countries to enhance policy coherence, the objectives of PCSD are, first of all, to maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs across these environmental, social, and economic priorities. But it is also, the purpose is to balance domestic and international priorities. Sometimes the focus, and we have seen this in some of the OECD countries when it comes to implement the SDGs, sometimes the focus is in the domestic level, but I think as Lewis highlighted, I mean, sustainable development is a global concept. We are all interconnected when it comes to sustainable development. So there is a need to balance the domestic priorities with the international priorities or commitments. And finally, the third objective of PCSD in this context is to really address the transboundary and long-term effects of policies. So at the OECD, we are working to developing some guidance and support countries in making this concept operational. And we are developing some tools and some analysis to inform the decision making in OECD countries and also in partner countries. So I stop there, but I will be happy to explain during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. Estelle, I might come to you next and ask you about COVID-19 recovery. Do you think a PCSD approach is important to a sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery? And if so, why?
Yes, I think policy coherence is kind of fundamental. However, I think just because it's fundamental doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to do. And I think that, you know, some of the previous speakers have highlighted some of the, I guess, some of the trade-offs and the different positions that people take at an individual, at a sectoral, and at a societal level. And I think that, you know, different people have different belief systems, they have different priorities, and therefore looking at coherence is always going to be fundamentally challenging, and therefore isn't necessarily as embedded in our decision making as it needs to be. I think policy coherence is an important mechanism that we certainly need to explore further. And we clearly, and clearly the current pandemic has highlighted some very stark examples of where we need more regional, more national and more global cooperation to tackle sort of challenging global issues. And certainly we need more coherent policies. So absolutely, I think it's fundamental in how we move forward. I guess an interesting position, I think, from international development, and certainly our role in ID, is really thinking about how we support other areas of government to really start sort of self-reflecting and thinking about the positions that they take, the positions that their stakeholders and that people within society that they are representing, where we feel that we need to progress coherence, and then thinking about how we actually can collaborate better. And I think the tool that has been developed here is a really great starting point for that, and it certainly allows us to start collecting evidence and to really sort of thinking about where a society we are positioned here in Scotland, and what does that actually mean with regards to the way that we want to develop policies, and what does that mean to the international communities and countries that we have strong relationships and we want to support. And I think that with, you know, having that self-reflection and then thinking about how we collaborate and communicate better, and therefore how do we sort of move further towards the sustainable development goals, and therefore how do we also make ourselves more resilient for pandemics such as COVID-19, but also, you know, still the other pressing issues such as climate change and biodiversity loss. So we've still got, you know, some big challenges ahead, and I do see obviously policy coherence as a key mechanism within that.
Great, thank you, Estelle. Graham, I might come to you now and ask you, how does policy coherence for sustainable development link to other important agendas such as well-being, economy, domestic issues, that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll try and share just a quick slide on this so people can see this. So I think I'm going to give you a slightly academic-y answer and then try for something more specific. So again, I'm having trouble sharing this full screen. Start from the beginning. Right. So I think I think some of the questions actually I've just been reading, kind of pulling out. There's two elements to policy coherence for sustainable development. So policy coherence, the idea of kind of somehow lots of different elements mutually reinforcing or supporting each other, and also then what the policy coherence is with or for. So the particular kind of thing that you're trying to cohere these things together for, or with reference to, or kind of testing them against. And so I think there's a difference between kind of pointing out policy coherence and policy incoherence, and policy coherence or incoherence, especially from the standpoint of looking for sustainable development. I think just as another kind of background point, I think it's important to, maybe kind of Ernesto made this point already, that, and Lewis, I guess everybody's made this point, that there are so you can talk about kind of global and domestic policy coherence. So, for example, kind of looking at whether your domestic policies on, say, I don't know, fossil fuel consumptions undercut your global policy of kind of fulfilling a commitment to a green finance fund or something like this. But you can also look at kind of coherence between the policy goals you want to meet and the means you use to achieve those goals. You can look at policy coherence between the outcome that you look for and the process through which you achieve that outcome. So you might kind of look to, I don't know, produce a country that was kind of stressed participatory democratic governance, but then go about that exercise in a not very participatory way, and that would be kind of incoherent. You can also kind of talk about present and future generations in the same country, and you can also talk about socioeconomic groupings and impacting socioeconomic groupings differently within a country. So policy coherence for sustainable development is quite a broad idea. And so the academic answer to kind of what's the relationship between policy coherence for sustainable development and the wellbeing economy is, well, it depends on exactly what you mean by sustainable development and the wellbeing economy. So I take it that those two things are pretty close together. So if you kind of think about policy coherence domestically, a lot of the objectives of the wellbeing economy look like they're covered somewhere in the list of SDGs. I think if I was going to kind of suggest a question that needs a bit more thought, I think it's exactly where these two do part companies. So whether they have, for example, whether they kind of, even though they have the same objectives, whether they put those things in the same kind of order, or whether they have the kind of exactly the same understanding of some of the ideas, I think there things get more tricky. I guess pragmatically, fortunately, a lot of what you might want for policy coherence for sustainable development would also be what you would want for policy coherence for a wellbeing economy in practice. And so I think that's kind of helpful. Generally, the point behind that is that, so policy coherence is an intuitively attractive idea. So nobody likes to be incoherent. Well, so I say that, I think that for politicians, I think not stressing coherence has its advantages, because it lets you kind of appear to be meeting multiple different policy objectives at once without necessarily trying to grapple with the trade-off or exactly how you kind of think about the relationship between those different areas. So I think sometimes policy incoherence looks tempting, but policy incoherence always looks like something that's worth pointing out, and is always kind of a powerful critique. But then once you get into that, into exactly what policy coherence for sustainable development kind of is constituted by, what you need to do that, I think it becomes heavily contextual. So it just depends on how your system of kind of governance operates, which level of governance you're thinking about, what your country's position is, what your local position is. And so there's kind of a need for extra knowledge there to successfully kind of understand and apply a PCSD. Whereas I think, so some kind of basic standard of avoiding incoherence, or the worst kind of incoherence, I think is easily understood and fairly easily applied. I think that might well kind of get broad support. I think that the final points of deciding exactly how to optimize policy coherence, so how to kind of to maximally, to ensure that your policies maximally support each other as much as they could, kind of really so not just kind of avoid negative effects, but kind of maximize the positive effects or synergies. I think that becomes much more tricky and much more context dependent. If only there was some kind of multi-user kind of public accessible source in which people could work through some of these questions. That's the PCSD Wiki. Right, I'll stop.
Excellent, thank you for that little plug there, Gail. I think we do have quite a lot of questions that are coming up in the question and answer box, so I think we'll maybe just move straight into them, because they're directly talking to some of that really excellent introduction pieces that you've all given. So we have a couple of questions related to follow-up questions on the COVID-19 response. Recovery from David Somerville. We watching Scottish Government, we see that the Economic Advisory Group is the first to be reporting. I think that was supposed to be happening at the end of June, on what they think is the way out of the pandemic. How can we better advocate the danger in always emphasising economic growth over people, well-being and planet ecology? And then we had another question kind of related from Lucy Greenhill, which was asking if policy coherence is about primarily achieving cost effectiveness efficiencies across government departments, and therefore should be a primary aspect in approaching COVID-19 recovery, given the economic challenges, diverted funds, etc. Estelle, would you maybe like to give a stab at that one, and others can come in?
Hi, yes, yeah, I'll have a stab at it. Absolutely, we've got the advisory group on the economic recovery. My understanding is that we have economic advisors, the Just Transition Commission, which has been set up and has been, I guess, dealing with some of these trickier issues that we've been grappling with around the trade-offs between economic growth and the environment, and really starting to think about how we move towards the sort of the net zero commitment that we've made, how we look at environmental protection going forward. So again, that's an area that obviously has had a lot of thinking prior to the COVID outbreak. And therefore they're feeding in. There's also the Poverty and the Inequalities Commission and the Infrastructure Commission. So there are a number of groups that are feeding into that advisory, the economic recovery. And also there has been the pledge with regards to the green recovery, which is another component which has really come to fruition since the COVID outbreak. So these areas are being looked at. I'm certainly sure that they can be improved upon and that other groups should be involved, and I think that will progress over time, but I think there is a relatively diverse group feeding into that. And really there is also the need to bring obviously the private sector and businesses along with that. So obviously those, now that whilst we're still obviously it's relatively early stages of still dealing with the immediate threat of the virus, it's really thinking about how we can bring those people to make sure that they're feeding in. I think it's also worth mentioning that the First Minister has obviously published the coronavirus decision sort of framework for decision making. So again, that's another mechanism that will bring in other voices and other groups. So I think that will, or I hope that will help shape the agenda and bring the environment into that as much as we can. I also think that absolutely, with regards to Lucy's question, I think there is going to be a major need for efficiency savings, a major need to look across different areas of governance and work more coherently from a domestic level. And I think what's really important is we also don't forget the international component within that as well. We can't just focus domestically. We do need to make sure that we are giving due consideration to the international aspect of what COVID, and equally what, you know, the climate emergency and the emergency for nature and biodiversity has also that we've been grappling with. So yes, I completely agree. I think it is about efficiency, and it is about more coherence at a domestic, but also thinking on that international level.
Thank you, Estelle. And Ishani, would you have anything to add on that one?
Yes, so in terms of the economic issue, this is something very, very much at the heart of sustainable development. Without giving you a very long-winded answer, we often we live in a flawed system where there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the current economic model isn't meeting our needs as a society, as a global society. And sustainable development tries to grapple with this. So I've been recently thinking that this whole situation really reminds me so much of 2009, when there was a lot of clamor from the various sectors, not just people who overtly work under the label of sustainable development, about after the financial crash, about, you know, we have a chance. The crash, yes, horrible, but it's an opportunity to restructure our economy, to restructure our society, to really think about what do we actually want, what do we actually need, and what is going to meet our needs. And there was a huge movement, and then we somehow ended up back at business as usual. And I met a German academic at some conference I went to, Catherine Trebek, I think you were there. and he was saying, we were talking about this crash and how things were in Britain, and he said, you know, the solution has been, the solution that many governments have taken has been something like, if you go to the doctor and you say, these pills you gave me, they're not working and they're making me feel a bit sick, and then the doctor says, well, just go home and take double your dose. You know, so we doubled down on the same model and same principles. And what I was talking about, I noticed there's a question here about trade-offs, and just to bring that into this economic issue, the well-being, structuring your economy around well-being is the ultimate integrated solution where you minimize trade-offs. So I didn't, just to be clear, I didn't say you can totally avoid trade-offs necessarily, but you're not looking for trade-offs, you're looking for integrated solutions. So a lot of us don't really understand what an economy is. We haven't really thought about it. It's just a thing that everyone talks about, GDP, you know, it's about jobs and money and stuff. But actually, if you really think about what an economy is, it is about how we meet our needs. So we get a job so that we can afford to eat and, you know, live in a house and whatever. Your individual economy is about your livelihood, the favors you trade with other people so that they can help you. It's about how you acquire resources. Your household economy is about how your household manages to meet its need, and the same for the global economy. So when an economy stops meeting our needs or never meets some people's needs, then we have a problem. And my research, so I'm also doing a PhD, and my research that I've been looking into shows so much evidence that the headline measure for the economy, GDP, is a measure that was constructed just prior to World War II to enable resources to be maximized, to mobilize for war. And we still have that same indicator as our headline indicator. So there's a problem there. So we're focusing on expanding, rather than on meeting people's needs. So there is already an inherent conflict in there. And yes, I think other people can talk very much better than me about the well-being economy, but focusing on meeting our needs as an economic goal rather than trying to expand continually is probably a much more integrated and better solution. And I'll just leave you with a quote from Edward Abbey, who was a very long time ago conservationist, who says something along the lines of, perpetual growth is the strategy of a cancer cell.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Ishani. We have a question from Tristan Weller, and he was wondering if the panel could give an example of policy incoherence. Now, I think, and talk about potential steps towards redressing it. I think we did start to talk about that in the presentations. I think, Graham, you were giving some concrete examples of policy incoherence. Would anyone else like to pick up on that? I don't seem to have any takers to be coming up with more examples.
I can say a bit more if you want.
Policy incoherence. Graham, do you want to just maybe elaborate a little bit on what some of the examples you gave?
Yeah, so I think there are some, so I think the internal-external kind of split shows, well, so actually there's some kind of external incoherences, I think they're quite kind of obvious. So I think the kind of the potential conflict between what you do or don't do about illicit flows and tax evasion and global tax havens versus the money you give in development assistance, I think is a potential kind of clear incoherence. As I say, I think kind of funding for fossil fuels and kind of international trade with a fossil fuel component, or kind of underpinned by fossil fuels that then kind of at the same time you fund kind of climate change adaptation, just seems like it kind of they pull in opposite directions. Funding arms sales versus kind of affirming the global rule of law and the need for peace looks incoherent. I mean, a more concrete example I think that kind of came up on a different call I was on yesterday, specifically in response to COVID. So one kind of way of looking at COVID in cities is to think about disparities in green space and access to green space amongst kind of disadvantaged groups. And I kind of, it might seem like the obvious way to solve that disparity was just to create a lot more green space of the kind that people want to use. But I think the coherence question there is how that works for biodiversity and conservation. And so we would have to kind of ask or check whether the kind of green space that we might kind of hastily give access to, and the kind that people wanted to use for exercise, was the same kind of green space that that could also kind of help to kind of ease a kind of ecological crisis, or make sure the city was doing its fair bit on biodiversity or conservation, or whether there's two objectives potentially pull in opposite directions. So I think that's kind of policy coherence as sort of a test or a challenge in kind of part of the COVID context.
Yeah, great, thank you, Graham. It kind of brings it very immediate. We have a couple of questions for Ernesto. And again, I think you did touch on this, Ernesto. PCSD, wait a minute, I've been moved, my questions have moved away. PCSD has somewhat objective goals with a focus on the long term, the now and the later. Party politics is subjective and governments have short-term goals due to elections, etc. How do we bridge the gap? And I know that you did start to talk about this, Ernesto. We have another question for you as well. Can you please point us towards evidence or cases where employing PCSD practices has made governments more effective? And how do these effectiveness benefits accumulate over time? Maybe if you could address those questions, Ernesto.
Sure. The first question about the long-term and the short-term cycles of government. This is a key challenge when it comes to promote policy coherence. Actually, we've seen that in the context of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, when some governments have established or have expressed a strong commitment to implement the agenda in a coherent manner, and they set up like institutional mechanisms, integrated frameworks, but then the government changes and everything is reprioritized. And then you have different priorities. The SDGs structures and frameworks that were created become like a secondary priority. But we also have seen some experiences. For example, I was remember now that the cases, two cases. One is in Finland, where they changed the mandate of one of the key institutional mechanisms, which is the National Commission for Sustainable Development, in a way that overlaps the mandate of these mechanisms with the government cycle. So to ensure that the commitment that the government in place makes to implement the Sustainable Development Goals is preserved when the government changes. So this is a kind of mechanisms that can help in the long term, give continuity to some of the government priorities and continue with the implementation of some of the measures. And I think that's been happening in Finland for the past, when they changed government very recently. And the same happened, for example, in the case of Mexico. There was a completely different government a couple of years ago, and with a strong commitment to the agenda, and they set up a lot of mechanisms, but they modified the legislation to ensure that the national development plan that the government has to develop at the beginning of the mandate included the Sustainable Development Goals. So the new government had to really, in the new development plan, integrate the Sustainable Development Goals in their sectoral priorities, in the key priorities for the 6-term year, government plan. So this is, again, another perhaps measure, legislative measure, or these changes can help to preserve some of the commitments. And we've seen that in some cases this has worked. I mean, there is this is a critical challenge, and because we understand and we see that policy coherence is not a technical solution, it's not a technocratic solution, but it entails a lot of political issues. It entails a lot of interests that need to be managed, and as part of recognition of this, we have developed at the OECD what we call the building blocks for policy coherence. And then perhaps I would be happy to share with you just one slide if you think.
Yeah, that's helpful, Ernesto, go ahead.
So I don't know if you're now seeing my screen.
Yes, we are.
Okay, so we have identified what we call building blocks for policy coherence. That starts with political commitment, of course, to mobilize the whole government with the long-term vision to inform policy making and decision making in the short term and on the implications for the long term. The structures and mechanisms for policy integration, which entails new mandates for all, institutions and programs that are to a certain extent required to integrate sustainable development aspects. Of course, coordination, but coordination to deal with trade-offs and minimize the negative impacts is not just about sharing information or allocating resources more effectively. Subnational engagement, because incoherences happen at all levels, not only at the national level, but also when it comes to implementation, particularly in key areas where local governments have a big competence, like, land use or water resources or public education, etc. These are key areas where they have a prominent role. And of course, stakeholder engagement is critical to inform policy making and mobilize action for policy coherence, and the capacity to address policy impacts and systems to monitor and report back on changes on policy. So these are what we consider the building blocks. There is no blueprint to promote policy coherence, but we have identified through our work that these mechanisms, what we call building blocks, that refer to processes, practices in public administration, are common in many countries with different political traditions. So we've seen this in many countries with different contexts, and the recommendation we are developing and the tools we are developing are to reinforce the capacities of governments in all these 8 areas, and to make sure that the processes by which policies are designed, implemented, and monitored are based or anchored on policy coherence perspectives to make sure that the policy outcomes and effects are aligned with sustainable development goals. I hope that responds some of the questions.
Yes, thank you. And just a quick follow-up, Ernesto. We have a question from Jill Matthews. Is the relative weakness of global institutions for governance at a planetary scale a problem?
It is a problem. Well, I think Graham was mentioning the different levels of coherence at the international, at the global level. Of course, there are a lot of incoherence between the different international regimes, and there is a need of coordinated action and strong institutions at the global level to make sure that this international regimes like the trade system and international property rights and etc., they are aligned with sustainable development objectives. For the moment, they are not in many cases. So there is a need to strengthen the multilateral system. There is a need to strengthen coordinated action at all these levels, because even if at the national level, you try to promote coherence, if the enabling environment, if the international enabling environment is not there, then your efforts might be limited, is what we've seen.
Sure. Thank you. Graham, I maybe come to you with this one. From Paul Brady, we have a question about language, the language in policy coherence, and it's going back to this issue about the kind of the advisory group on economic recovery, primarily coming from a corporate kind of investment bank or similar background. And the question is, will the policy coherence language connect with these minds, or do we need to adjust the language for different audiences for greater impact? Do you come in on that one?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, I think, so I think a bit of policy coherence appeals quite nicely to sort of an efficiency mindset. So this idea of either kind of minimizing trade-offs or maximizing benefits, or sort of quick wins, or so I think a lot of the academic work around so kind of a subsection of the academic work around the SDGs is pretty much, you know, in this sort of vein. And where would be the entry points into the SDGs where we could do the most good for the least cash? And I think that kind of emphasis on PCSD as kind of an efficiency tool I imagine might kind of, so I don't want to kind of, well, we shouldn't kind of denigrate the breadth of the mindset of the people on particular groups, but I guess you might kind of think that would appeal more to a kind of straightforwardly sort of efficiency, way to optimality kind of mindset. I think two other things are relevant here. So a couple of questions in the chat. I think the kind of the makeup of that group seems pretty important. And I think it's interesting that policy coherence for sustainable development, when you look at the content of sustainable development there, as in the SDGs, has an explicit kind of participatory component. And it also has an emphasis on kind of the well-being and the inclusion of the poorest, most vulnerable and marginalized. And I think here is where the content of PCSD looks trickier. So we had Rory Stewart, when he was International Development Secretary in front of Parliament in the UK last year, when I was kind of serving as advisor to that committee. And we kind of asked him about Leave No One Behind and kind of vulnerable and marginalised groups. And he gave a pretty fair answer, which is that, well, we can sort of tinker around the edges, but if we really wanted to sort of reorient our thinking as a government on sort of taking seriously the idea of putting first or focusing on the people at the very kind of bottom of society or the most excluded from society, that would be a huge shift, and it would require a shift from the top. I mean, so don't get me wrong, I don't agree with all his answers to all our questions. I thought that was true. And I tend to think that COVID might be an opportunity to push some of that. So kind of the leave no one behind language is kind of ubiquitous, I think, to the extent where it maybe even becomes a bit unhelpful. But I think that the way that sustainable development in SDG terms puts this emphasis on participation and puts the emphasis on vulnerable and marginalised groups, I think would be really helpful as a lens to bring to the discussion there. If you can indulge me for a second, I think just the flip side, I think, so I saw some comments about the relationship between the wellbeing economy and economic growth. I think the reason why, so the SDGs, people kind of point to goal 8, and the wiki points to goal 8 and says, well, there's an explicit GDP growth target. How can that be coherent? And I think the answer is kind of a process answer. So my experience of the negotiations was that if you, and especially, I think, people from developing countries, so leaders of countries in the G77 plus China group, you know, were asked what they wanted to see on a sustainability agenda, but also a development agenda. And I think the target is there partly because the leaders of those countries said, look, what our people need are growth and jobs. And I think we can, so I think, in the end, it might turn out that they were wrong, or they just weren't thinking kind of hard enough or big enough about the nature of the well-being economy and the future of the planet. But I think there's a real tension here in telling people in that situation that they're wrong about how they think they should balance the needs of the present and the needs of the future. You know, as kind of SD, one of its formulations does. I think we should be kind of hesitant about that, not least because the SDG agenda itself builds in lots of places, interesting for international development, kind of an emphasis on national ownership of their development plans and kind of international development funds somehow being sensitive to what countries want. I think we should be kind of very careful about telling people that SD has to mean this, or that we should be sensitive to the idea that the wellbeing economy might look different depending on whether you're sat in Scotland or in Malawi.
Okay, thank you, Graham. We have a question for all of you. What metrics, this is from Simon, I think that's Simon Anderson from IIED, what metrics can be used to demonstrate the benefits of PCSD? I think I'll maybe ask Ishani that. Ishani, have you any thoughts? What metrics can be used to demonstrate the benefits of PCSD?
Yeah, so this is a very difficult but also a very PCSD type of question. So I personally am not keen on metrics because I think we went through a period from the 90s and the noughties and into the teenies, where, or whatever you call them, where we got really focused on measuring things in metrics, in numbers, and really we ended up with a bunch of perverse outcomes. So the classic example is A&E waiting time. So this is the one that the Royal Commission for Statistics or whatever always trot out when they come to talk to you, that there's a your A&E staff is supposed to see everyone within 4 hours. So the way you see the graph of the 4 hours is you see like a steady number of patients being seen, and then in about 3.5 hours you see a massive spike. So what is happening there? Are those people who are being seen at the end getting the correct treatment that they should be? Are they getting enough attention? You know, what's happening there? And I mean, there's loads of others. I used to work at SEPA, and there was a answer every phone call within 24 hours. So I'm very wary about metrics, and I'm not sure that we should be thinking about measuring. I think we should be thinking more about evaluating and assessing and doing things in a much more qualitative way in terms of how much are we meeting people's needs. Are people who are most disadvantaged, is the disparity between the most well off and the least well off declining? And that doesn't have to be a number like income, it can be much more qualitative. So I don't want to give you a metric because I don't think that's the right way to go.
Okay. Did anyone else want to come in on that one? Okay, all right. We have a question from Chris Hegarty from Christian Aid. What do the panel think tends to be the main hurdle or blocker for genuine PCSD implementation, and what works best in getting around that? He's especially interested in anything you might be able to say, Estelle, with regards to challenges in the Scottish Government.
Okay, shall I go first?
Yeah.
So I think it was, it builds on the metric question actually previously. I think, as we've discussed, like language, talking in, we have a particular language within international development, and other people have languages that do similar things in their own sector or their own discipline, and they haven't connected them. So I think language is a barrier. I think awareness and having really strong tools that we can start assessing these. I think how do we implement it, I think, is one of the key issues that we need to really get our head around. And I think also, as we sort of said before, I think people's histories, people's priorities, people prioritize different things, and therefore when it comes to actually having coherence, it's really about trying to weigh off those priorities and start addressing the trade-offs. So I think environmental impact assessments are really strong tools. But again, they need alignment, they need more coherence between them. We have environmental impact assessments, we have equality impact assessments, we have island impact assessments. So we've got a number of these different tools, but I think they need more streamlining and need to be made more applicable to the decision making and the evidence-based process. So I think it's about gathering quality evidence that we can base decisions on that help with some of those prioritization and trade-off questions. And yeah, I think it's having, raising awareness of this as a mechanism and a system, so that people, I've certainly, in my experience in I guess, engaging with different sectors and different departments across government, I've found huge amounts of willingness and huge amounts of interest in this approach. So I certainly don't think it's a lack of interest and a lack of people wanting to engage. I think there are just genuine barriers around priorities, around language, that we need to keep plugging away at.
Thank you, Estelle. I have a question for all of you. Again from Simon, is PCSD in OECD countries more feasible than in developing countries that are subjected to the effects of policy incoherence from the global north? Ernesto, I might come to you on that. Is PCSD in OECD countries more feasible than in developing countries?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because what we have seen, especially in the context of sustainable development, given that many of the developing countries had the experience from the implementation of the MDGs in the past, they set up structures and they set up planning processes. For them, the concept of PCSD is very relevant. In fact, we have heard that in our discussions with developing countries. They say, when we discuss, for example, in the past, PCD, the concept that comes from the donor community to make sure that what is given with one hand is not taken up from the other, they were saying, well, that's for donors. That's not relevant for me. It's the responsibility for the donor country to deal with policy coherence for development. And we are kind of the countries that are affected by those domestic policies. But when it comes to the context of sustainable development and the SDGs in particular, they see PCSD as a principle to ensure effectiveness in their implementation, as a principle to engage the whole of government, and not only the whole of government, but also other actors in implemented integrated solutions for sustainable development, to have more capacities to think on the long term and these kind of things. So I would say what we have seen in some cases, there is a very interesting case in Mongolia right now. For example, they have set up a completely new structure along the lines of the 8 elements that I described in my slide, following some of the experiences from some of the OECD countries in setting up a policy coherence structure to address the sustainable development goals. And because they have these experiences in their own national planning processes, in some cases they have central planning, which is not the case in many of the OECD countries. So actually, we see sometimes it's more difficult for OECD countries to try to have a more integrated whole of government, because of course, specialization and decentralization was key in some years ago. And we set up structures in OECD countries to really have specialized sectors dealing with public problems. But now when it comes to bring all that sectors together, there is no structure, there is no planning process, central planning process to do that. And in developing countries, that exists already. So I would say, well, it depends on the context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto. I'm going to start wrapping up our discussion. I have a couple of final questions, which can maybe go to all the panelists. So one is from James Mackey. How might the Scottish Government best ensure that its commitment to PCSD survives and is passed on to the next government after the elections next year? So a question around about kind of Scottish Government. And then also, what can this diverse range of civil society representation participating in this call today help do? What can civil society do to help enhance PCSD in Scotland? So it's kind of the two elements as a kind of final wrap up. What can Scottish Government do? What can civil society do? And I'll maybe just go to each of you to do a little bit of a wrap on that. So I'll go to Ishani first.
Okay, yeah, so can I answer about the audience first? So this, yeah, diversity is great. It's, you know, resilience, diversity is a key component of resilience. And if you look at all, most, you know, academic and practitioner opinion around sustainable development, it's about multidisciplinarity, having as many voices around the table as possible, and that's what the work I've been doing with the Parliament is also about. And just to be clear, that policy coherence, you know, when you think about it, can be a real double-edged sword. And I think someone else mentioned this. You can focus your country on taking over the rest of the world and subjugating it, or you can focus it on, you know, anything you want. So that's why it's important to remember that we're talking about policy coherence for sustainable development. And again, I think that if we, all of us, keep that broad aim in mind, then we can bring different solutions to the table. And there is no one size fits all, as I think Graham was saying, you know, about the growth issue. I must apologize for the fact that I didn't talk about low-income countries. But it's about, you know, when you start to think about how to bring sustainable development to your context, your community, your country, or whatever, your city, there's a multiplicity of good solutions. And really the issue to make sure that that policy coherence exists is about looking for conflicts and thinking at multiple levels. So you think about your needs, you think about your village needs, you think about your community, you think about, you know, how can you fit all that together? And I know this sounds a bit vague, but you have to understand the principles before you get in there and start thinking about measuring and, you know, doing this and that with policy. So I think you have to look for solutions that can meet as many of the needs of your, whatever you're looking at, your community, as possible. And the other thing is, if you look at social change movements over time, the ones that haven't worked are the ones where people who share a broad vision but cannot agree on the detail, and they fall out, and you start having fractured movements. So really what you need to do is to approach a table openly, open to other people, and find, you know, make common cause. And I'll give you an example from a committee. So the human rights...
I'm actually, can we maybe, we've got 2 minutes left.
Sorry, okay, yeah, sorry. And as for the Scottish Government, there is a great report written by Scottish Environment Link and Sarah Boyack about how you can bring policy coherence before that was even a fashionable term. I'd be happy to dig it out when I have access to the office.
Brilliant, thanks Ishani. I'll ask the others maybe just to very quickly sum up just government, civil society. Estelle.
Okay, I am going to actually quickly do the two. With regards to James' question, we obviously have the ministerial group that was announced, and we have been doing work with regards to bringing that online for May. Obviously COVID has beaten us, so we're now looking at how we can best bring that back online and how we can align that, and that's particularly important with aligning with the economic recovery and the green recovery. So it's very much about working with our colleagues to make sure that we have policy coherence embedded in that work being taken forward. So that's work that we're currently undertaking. And I think with regards to civil society, it is about engaging, and I think it is about bringing your point of view, putting it in with the context of other people's point of view, and having those more developed conversations, I guess, around some of the areas that we're really struggling with as a society, and bringing what you feel is your solution. Obviously, it's not necessarily going to be everybody's solution, but I think as long as we can start having that debate, and you need to bring that to within the right mechanisms. So I would say for civil society to engage with the framework for decision makers, and to engage with the mechanisms that the Scottish Government has out there to really get your message across.
Thank you Estelle. Graham, some final thoughts from you.
Yes, I think the Scottish Government and kind of political system could concretise the concept, so give it some kind of genuine meaning and kind of fix it in public debate. And it could obviously kind of introduce some mechanisms that enshrined it. So the impact assessment kind of tool, I think, is very useful. Some kind of formal process around that would be one way of doing this. Some kind of formal mechanism for kind of checking the impact on future generations or whatever. I think for civil society groups, kind of people on the call. So I think there's a regulatory role to play where you can use kind of policy coherence as a check and challenge tool to kind of to point out incoherence and to kind of challenge governments on that. I think there's an element of kind of realization where they can use PCSD in their own work. I think the implications of PCSD for civil society are really interesting. And they can also kind of ensure that these kind of left behind groups are, I think, kind of a special role for civil society might be in kind of being a conduit or a voice for some of those groups.
Thank you, Graham. Final thoughts from you, Ernesto.
Sure. I mean, for us, as I mentioned, the stakeholder engagement is a key building block for policy coherence. I mean, we see that policy coherence requires mechanisms for dialogue and engagement whereby governments, key stakeholders, not only civil society, but others such as private sector, academia, scientists, can come together and identify challenges, set priorities, contribute to the development of laws and regulations, align actions, and mobilize resources for sustainable development. So engaging with stakeholders, and particularly civil society, in all phases of the policy cycle, including through knowledge or expertise, can help ensure a holistic perspective of sustainable development challenges and also give voice to diverse interests, identify potential trade-offs, and create ownership of the policy coherence solution. So for us, it's a key building block. And as I said, just to conclude, there is no blueprint for policy coherence. There are some tools that can support, that are common to many countries. And from OECD, we are happy to support governments and stakeholders in promoting these efforts. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. Just before we wrap, we do have a little survey which is going to pop up on your screen. I think it's just a couple of questions and you just need to tick the wee box. Fantastic, thank you. So if you could just do that before you leave, we would be really grateful. And then just before finishing, I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in organising this. I think it was a really rich discussion. The Alliance did a fantastic job of preparing it all and pulling it all together. And to each of our panelists as well, thank you so much. Thank you, Estelle, Ishani, thank you, Graham, thank you, Ernesto, for your engagement, for your engagement beforehand in the prep as well. And hopefully it's been useful for everyone. So thanks very much and goodbye.